I transformed this piece of digital art into this absolutely massive Minecraft build. And this isn't some rough interpretation either. This build lines up exactly with the original art to create a perfect transformation from a two-dimensional piece to a three-dimensional world, creating every aspect of the original artwork, replicating even the smallest details down to the positioning of the whiskers on the dragon and even the tiniest lanterns in the sky. Little did I know this was going to be the hardest thing I had ever done in Minecraft. Before the video goes on any further, I ask that you subscribe. I literally want to be a YouTuber more than anything else in this world, and your support can make that happen. Anyways, enjoy the video. Now, doing this was going to be an absolutely massive undertaking, and I knew that if I tried to pull this off with little to no planning, the entire video was just gonna crash and burn. It was not just the dragon I was going to have to build, but also a gigantic mountain range in the backdrop of the image that was going to be over 300 blocks tall. To secure my success, I drew out plans from a drop-down view trying to understand the three-dimensionality of this 2D image. After making an embarrassing amount of chicken scratch sketches and hanging them absolutely all over my walls like some sort of insane investigator, I faced something that I've been putting off on this channel for far too long. World Painter. Little did I know my plans were about to drastically change after I downloaded the program and learned its basics. Because after spending 2 hours making the foundations of the terrain, the program just started randomly glitching horribly for seemingly no reason, to the point where it was unusable despite my incredibly tech-savvy attempts at solving the problem. Fed up with my failed effort at learning something new, I decided to challenge myself and test my skills with World Edit. Little did I know this would literally cost me my sanity. Make sure to stick around until the end of this video to see if those extra 79,000 stairs placed was worth the pain for the final build. Now, before we go forward, I think it's important to give credit to the artist who produced the original work that this entire video is based off of. His name is Xijin Wu. Sorry if I absolutely butchered that name, by the way, but you can go check out his work with a higher quality resolution on ArtStation. Starting things off in the actual world, I realized that in order to make all the proportions correct for literally every aspect of this transformation, I would have to start off with the dragon instead of the surrounding terrain. You see, if I made the terrain too small, the dragon would be too small, making it so that I couldn't include the insane level of detail I was going for. Once the back of the dragon was complete, I raised the entire outline of the peninsula where the digital art was focused so I could start building the steep cliffs that would hold the rice terraces. I immediately realized the massive amount of work that was ahead of me when building these terraces because every single one of them had to be lined with stairs that would be placed entirely by hand. And there were going to be more terraces in this map than I could count, covering all of the plateaus that held them. I created another plateau that is actually seen in the image on the left hand side, including even more rice terraces. I then connected the main peninsula to it, forming what would eventually be a large valley that the dragon would fly through in the final image. After completing the rough outlines of the valley and all of its levels, I then did the same on the other side of the peninsula, forming another valley ending with an untouched mountain. It was at this point in the process where I truly realized just how long this biome was going to take to complete. It was absolutely massive, and I still had the 300 block tall mountains, the lakes, and the forest. But before I get ahead of myself, I began to paint the mountain ranges with different variations of green to create a lush look on the cliffs and the slopes down to the riverbeds, which would eventually lead to those massive mountains I was just talking about. And this is where the incredibly long and boring process of placing nearly 80,000 stairs truly began, as I started to detail the terraces and make it so that they could now hold water. Over the course of an entire week, I slowly worked my way around the map, covering every terrace with stairs and then filling them with water. This was one of the key turning points because not only did I think I had made it over a major hurdle in the project, but the change also brought the terrain to life. But if you're thinking at this point in the video my struggle with the stairs would be over, you're dead wrong. I was only halfway through my stair placing journey, but more on that in a second because I still had these lakes to complete. Using a variety of blocks, I painted out a shoreline and filled its lower regions with kelp and water that would flow out to the roots of the mountains. After finishing those final details in the valley, I moved up the main peninsula where the dragon would be flying and the other 40,000 stairs were waiting to be placed. However, this time things would be different for one sole reason. These terraces were actually in view when comparing them to the digital art. And remember what I said at the beginning of this video. I wanted everything to correspond exactly with the digital art. So that's what I did. I aligned every single terrace by hand before before moving on to other pieces of terrain that were out of the view of the original art. Adding these top terraces finally gave the plateau some weight to it because it no longer looked like a hollow set of curving walls. At this point, I was so over building stairs that I tried to include them as little as possible in areas of the terrain that were not in view in the digital art. And with all the stairs finally placed, the plateau and its valleys were complete, meaning I could now move on to smoothing out the base of the plateaus, which would lead to the huge set of mountains on the other side. It was finally time to face the largest part of this entire build, the massive mountain range that would climb to a total of 380 blocks tall in the final build. I have to admit, it was a major relief knowing that I didn't have to cover everything in terraces. Instead, I made rolling hills at their bases, which would soon accompany a vibrant forest overlooking the lake system. Once I had smoothed everything out and gotten a relatively jagged set of peaks that looked similar to the digital art, I covered their bases with a layer of lush green grass and a gray shoreline for the lakes. Now, what's crazy for me to think about is how even with Minecraft's new height limit and the mountains being as tall as they were, their height still didn't feel great enough in comparison to the art. Despite this, I moved excitedly onto the final bit of terrain for this entire project, the forest. I made a few dark oak tree variations that had a slight Asian stylization to them and then painted them around the bottom of the mountain. And that was it. Everything had been leading up to this moment. The moment where I could finally start work on the bulk of the dragon and make this entirely replicate the digital art. Starting the dragon was one of the hardest parts of replicating it all together, because not only did I want to match the movement that the dragon had in the original piece, but I also needed to make sure that it really looked like it was flying weightlessly through the world. After 20 or so attempts, I finally got it and was able to start coloring his skin. Now, this is actually a very special part of the build because I replicated the lighting on the dragon's skin and hair flawlessly in comparison to the digital art. This would give the illusion of light and shadow as if I were shading with different block types to really make everything pop. After sculpting and coloring every piece of the dragon's hair by hand, I moved on to making his arm. These were difficult as well because they are deceivingly skinny in the image, but after applying the same kind of block placement that I used for the rest of his skin, they matched the rest of his body perfectly. The head was going to prove to be the final boss as I suspected, mainly due to the vibrancy and magical glow he seemed to possess in his hair, which required at least 6 different block types just to get right, not to mention the shape and angle his head was at while doing all of this. I knew I was really getting down to the final details when I built the dragon's extremely long whiskers blowing in the wind and the giant lantern he held in his mouth as he flew off into the sunset. And now it was time for the smallest of details, the people riding the cows and watching the mythical beast flow through the sky in front of them. Now, every single one of these cows has its own place in the digital art and is built with the same lighting position to match up exactly. Not to mention the absolute smallest detail of all, one that probably no one would notice but I had to include, was the exact positioning of the lanterns being released to the dragon by one of the farmers. With that said, the entirety of this build and the digital art's transformation is complete. Make sure to stay tuned until after the cinematic where I'm going to show you the side-by-side comparison and see just how close I got to the original piece of art. And this is it, the final reveal. How does my build compare to the digital art? Are they exactly the same? Surprisingly, yes, for the most part they are. After having my graphics designer bring every aspect of my build into one shot, I was finally able to appreciate just how close I got. Now, this obviously isn't an in-game view entirely, as we had to render different parts of the build separately due to its huge scale. But everything you're seeing right now is in the world you just watched me create. Let me know how you guys think I did, and I'll see you in the next video.